In 1997, Squaresoft released the 7th installment in their legendary Final Fantasy series for the PlayStation 1. Spanning 3 discs, the game told an incredible tale I'm sure you're more than familiar with if you've stumbled onto a channel as niche as this one. Final Fantasy VII was an incredible, revolutionary game and fondly remembered by oh so many people. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. As you may or may not be aware, there's an expanded universe for this one particular title, something not uncommon for more successful entries in the series. Just off the top of my head I can think of 10-2, 4 the After Years, and 13-2 and 3. But 7 is somewhat of an anomaly. No entry has been fleshed out to the extent that that game has. Squaresoft, later Square Enix, made not only more games, but also anime, novels, and even a major motion picture. But were they any good? I want to break them all down one entry at a time for you, and give you a comprehensive history and my personal opinion. We'll start today with the first release both chronologically in our world and in the timeline, 2004's Before Crisis, Final Fantasy VII. Now, I won't exactly be surprised if you haven't heard of Before Crisis. This is the only entry in the compilation to not see a Western release in any official capacity whatsoever. And there are a couple of reasons for this. First off, it's a mobile phone game. So what, I hear you say? Everybody's got smartphones, right? Well, 2004 phones looked a little less like this, and a lot more like this. Games were much less accessible back then. Data plans weren't really a thing everybody had. If it wasn't pre-installed when you bought the phone, you probably weren't going to play it. Personally, I don't think I played any mobile phone games other than Snake on my Nokia 3310 until I got my Galaxy S2. Oh, I guess there was Rayman Golf pre-installed on something I had. That sure was a thing that existed. Japan, on the other hand, has always been a market leader in technology, and the mobile gaming scene was going strong even back then. The market was more than viable for an ambitious project like Before Crisis. And so, in 2002, led by Hajime Tabata, the game went into development for FOMA-compatible phones, which coincidentally were the world's first phones capable of 3G communications. Neat, right? They were also super stylish looking. I'd still like to have one of these nowadays. And the aesthetic of the game definitely leans on the cool factor that the flip phones give it. You use an in-game version of the same phone to contact HQ, and it appears in the opening cutscene as well. The licensing deal with the P900i V series of phones wasn't exclusive to Before Crisis either. In Advent Children, Cloud has one of these bad boys too until he drops it in a lake. Hope he didn't have that on a long contract. Made to expand on events and lore in the world of Final Fantasy VII, Before Crisis is a prequel taking place 6 years prior. Tetsuya Nomura, character designer for this and all other entries in the compilation, asked Tabata to make an experience from the perspective of the Turks. I'm sure you're already familiar with the Turks if you're watching a video like this, but a brief recap just in case. The Shinra Electric Power Company has a general army, a superhuman group of mercenaries called soldiers, and they also have the Turks. Officially, they're the investigation sector of the General Affairs Department, and their specialty lies in tactical espionage action and dirtier tasks like assassinations. They're basically anime hitmen, if I'm honest. Publicly, they also scout for candidates for the soldier program. Turks is actually a mistranslation that has stuck around. They were supposed to be called the Tasks, which is absolutely something I was always aware of, and not something I learned while researching this video. It was definitely an interesting concept to pull a switcheroo and turn antagonists from Final Fantasy VII into protagonists. I've always been a big fan of that trope, ever since I first experienced it in Sonic Adventure 2's Dark Side story. Anyway, let's get into this game's story, shall we? By far, the plotline is the easiest part of Before Crisis to document, due in no small part to a fantastic fan-translated playthrough uploaded by YouTube user Grimoire Valentine 10 years ago. We have a complete playthrough archived, which you've been seeing footage of while I've been rambling. I shot him a message before making this video, and he was incredibly kind enough to give me permission to use his footage. If you find this video interesting, please send him some love by checking out his channel with the full playthrough. So, who is the protagonist in this story? Well, that's actually entirely up to you to decide. Before Crisis has a total of 15 playable characters, which is absolutely phenomenal for a flip phone game from that long ago. The player gets to name all of the new characters, so officially they're known as Rod, Girl Martial Arts, Gun, Two Guns, Boy Martial Arts, Shotgun, Nunchuck, Knife, Shuriken, Katana, and Legend. Sung and Reno from VII are also playable at certain points, and so is the leader of the Turks, Veld. He's also known as Verdo in some translations. Strangely enough, fan favourite Rude is not playable in this game, but he does show up at least. Shuriken is also heavily involved in Crisis Core, and is considered to be the canon choice as a result by many fans. Some events that take place do overlap with Crisis Core, but we'll talk about that in more detail in my next video. I think the best course of action is to guide you through the first 5 chapters of the game's story. In my opinion, that's enough time to get a good feel of the plot, but still leave enough surprises and twists for those who want to discover the rest through Grimoire's playthrough videos. Chapter 1 acts as the game's tutorial, setting the scene in Sector 8 of Midgar. It definitely looks a little different from this perspective, but that's to be expected from a phone game. We're immediately introduced to Avalanche, an eco-terrorist group who disagree with Shinra's usage of life energy from the planet to power the city. They're prepared to do anything to stop this, and human casualties are A-OK in their book. In Final Fantasy VII, we only met Barret, Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, who lead a much less ruthless Splinter Cell of the group. I have to say, it's really interesting seeing the main Avalanche group taking on the role of antagonists in this game, and because of their less than savoury methods, they actually succeed in making the Turks look like good guys. Until Reno presses that big red button in 7 anyway. For now, it's up to you to stop the evil Avalanche from blowing up the reactor in Sector 8, and Sung is there to help you by explaining combat mechanics through your phone. It vibrates your actual phone when he calls you, which is kinda neat. After you've gotten to grips with the tutorial, you get surrounded by far too many Avalanche members to stop by yourself, which means it's time for Reno to show up. Have to have that fan service, am I right? Reno says he'll take care of them so you can progress the story. After shooting some more members in the face, you stop the plot and head back outside. A new character called Sears kicks the ever-loving crap out of you and Reno. Then, instead of doing the sensible thing and putting a bullet in your heads, leaves you to be finished off by a hapless goon who obviously fails. The Turks learn that Avalanche is planning an attack on the city of Junon, which is where the president of Shinra currently is. There's also a brief mention of a silver-haired soldier, which is excellent news for those veterans looking for a little bit more Bishonen to brighten their day. Chapter 2 picks up in Junon, where President Shinra is preparing to give a speech. Despite pleas from everyone around him, he's going to be a stubborn asshole and go ahead with everything. That's your cue to thwart several attempts upon his life, including snipers, attack hounds, and armed gunmen. It gets pretty crazy as assassination attempts go. Eventually, while you're cleaning up, Reno and the President are confronted by another new character, Fuhito. Reno fights him off screen while you race back to save them both. Arriving just in time, you fight him, you kick his ass, and then you fall over and he runs off without killing you. Yeah, I'm starting to notice a theme here. It's at this point the stakes really start to intensify, as Avalanche seizes control of the gigantic Mako cannon which is aimed directly at Midgar. Barret's version of Avalanche would never dream of destroying an entire city of people to protect the planet, so this really cements with you that maybe good and bad aren't always black and white, and that while the Turks aren't exactly good people, sometimes they're fighting for the right thing. Rufus makes a brief cameo, expressing interest in the player, and 100% does not give a crap about his dad's several assassination attempts. Father's Day must be fun at the Shinra house. Rufus pieces out and then Daddy gets shot in the gut by Fuhito, which as a veteran of 7 I can't help but find super satisfying. The chapter ends with him ordering for Sephiroth to finally be dispatched. We cut to the man standing next to the corpse of a behemoth, which is super rad. Chapter 3 is mostly fluff until near the end of the chapter. There are a lot of battles as you fight your way through grunts to get to the cannon and shut it off. Eventually, when you get there, you find a corridor that is absolutely covered in blood and corpses. It really reminds me of the scene in Metal Gear Solid 1 just before you fight Grey Fox in Otacon office. Pressing on, we see a strange woman with a sword mourn the loss of all of her Avalanche colleagues. She catches up to you and challenges you, thinking you murdered them. You didn't, but you have mowed down a metric ton of bodies anyway, so it's kinda justified. You have to lose this fight, it's mandatory. As a quick side note, the music track, Theme of Elfe, plays throughout, and it's a beautiful piece of music. It's just a shame that it has to be so bit-crushed for this game. There are vocal versions released that I'll link in the description that don't suffer from that problem. Check them out. After losing to Elfe, you stagger your way to the edge of the cannon, and finally somebody is actually going to finish you off. Of course, that's Sephiroth's cue to show up and save you. Elfe runs away, and Sephiroth just casually strolls off. The chapter ends with you shuffling your way back to HQ. Bossman Veld announces that to combat Avalanche, more soldiers are required, and so it's time to go scouting. Chapter 4 starts in the Costa del Sol, as you forcefully kidnap potential candidates for soldier. We've never seen how the Turks recruit before, so this is eye-opening. Zack and Cloud wanted desperately to become soldiers, so it was assumed it was entirely voluntary. This is the kind of stuff I love about Before Crisis. Extra detail that doesn't necessarily matter, just adds context and fleshes out the world. Other than that though, this chapter is long and honestly kinda boring, so I'm gonna speed through it. You fight Azul, a kidnapped recruit. He nearly wins until Rude knocks him out. Then Sears attacks the boat trying to free the prisoners. You go grab them, and then fight Azul for a second time as he willingly submits to the soldier program so he can get strong enough to kill you. Meanwhile, Reno and Rude go fight Sears. They win, but he gets away. A teaser showing a young Cloud Strife in Shinra uniform is a massively satisfying end to a mostly fluff chapter, so at least it has that going for it. Moving on to Chapter 5, you're tasked with protecting a Dr. Raleigh. She has important data related to the soldier program on her. Cloud is also on guard duty for the Professor, and you team up with him. Raleigh inevitably comes under attack, and the chapter focuses on your interactions with Cloud as he tries to save her, while you try to rescue the data she's carrying. Of course, you completely fail and the information gets stolen, but working alongside and even conflicting with an inexperienced and pre-Marco poisoning Cloud is just great fun. This is where we'll stop our storytime session for now, as the game has 25 chapters altogether, and if I went through all of them, we'd be here for literally hours. There are chapters dedicated to many familiar and well-loved faces from other entries in the compilation, and there is absolutely something for everybody to enjoy here. Some quick highlights from me personally include working alongside Zack Fair, the launch of Shinra Rocket No. 26, and Zack escaping with Cloud. The chapter with Barra is absolutely tragic, and if you don't follow up on anything else I've talked about, at least check out Chapter 16. Barrett fighting against Shinra as a leader of Avalanche when he has no idea it was them who caused him to lose everything he had is absolutely heartbreaking. The amount of content in this game is still thoroughly impressive even today, but you may be asking, how on earth did these phones fit this game onto the storage? Let's talk about that. Initially, Before Crisis was developed for a specific series of phones, the FOMA P900i series. These were some seriously swishy devices, and the specs these things had were so far beyond what we had in the West for the time, that even in 2006, when the game was being released for more phones in Japan, the vast majority of ours still hadn't caught up to the P900i, which was the reason a Western release of Before Crisis never occurred. It's not that they didn't try. There's documented evidence and interviews where Square Enix said that a localization was in progress before it was quietly axed. I would imagine that the release of the iPhone in 2007 also put the final nail in that coffin, but we may never truly know. I tried to look into how big the file size of the game was, but unfortunately I wasn't able to find that out. What I did find is that only the first chapter comes with the initial game, and every other chapter is an additional download. Let's not forget just how huge this game's story is, so at 25 chapters that has to be a fairly bulky file. It's fortunate that FOMA phones were compatible with microSD cards, as I imagine extra space was basically compulsory. Not only were there additional chapters to download, but extra gameplay modes were added over time to increase replay value as well. Free play mode allowed any of the playable characters you'd unlock to wander maps and grind for experience points, money, and other helpful items to help with the main story. There were also some additional quests to do as well. Rescue mode involved you assisting a fellow player on your actual device's contacts list during gameplay. A very clever addition, and it makes sense for Turks to help each other out. I can't help but wonder if some of this stayed with Tetsuya Nomura when he was designing the multiplayer mode for Kingdom Hearts 358 over 2 days. The Turks have quite a lot in common with Organisation 13 actually, but that's a subject that warrants its own separate video entirely if I'm honest. The graphics may look like hot garbage now from aged recordings, but for the time, and on a screen that small, they look beautiful according to reviews I've read. The phone was also able to display lots of models on screen at once, and rarely had any slowdown. An awful lot of care and attention was put into this game, and anyone calling it a cash grab is sadly misinformed. Character art and portrait pictures for the cast were provided by Nomura, who would continue to use this style in future projects, such as Square Enix's 2007 JRPG, The World Ends With You. It's very distinctive, and I'm personally a big fan of it. Something that was very heavily promoted and I really want to talk about is how the game integrated the use of the camera. If you've played the original, I'm sure you're more than familiar with materia. These magical spheres of crystallized Mako energy can be slotted into weapons and armor to access their powerful magical properties, such as blasting fireballs at your foes or casting magic on yourself to heal you. In other games, materia is found or purchased. Before Crisis has a unique method of acquiring materia through taking photos of objects in the real world. The game scans your photos, checks what the most prominent colour is, then creates a materia of that colour from your photo. It's interesting, but definitely gimmicky. I can't say how well this actually works or how random it is without being able to test it for myself, unfortunately. I do like the idea in concept. Before Crisis removes the turn-based combat from Final Fantasy VII in favour of a real-time action RPG with free movement during battle using the phone's number pad. The game is a 2D side-scroller, the only one in the compilation. From the footage of the game I've seen, your options in battle are a basic attack, casting a spell, using an item, and fleeing. These are all pretty standard for the series, and other than the real-time movement, there's not much engagement to be had. Combat purely feels like an excuse to break up the dialogue scenes. Even the late game bosses aren't very interesting to fight. I do appreciate that there's only so much you can do on a screen of that size, however. The game also lacks the traditional limit break, which is disappointing as it's one of the trademarks of Final Fantasy VII. Before Crisis is not a game that you play for the combat, I'll be upfront about that. There is some mild variety based on which character's weapon you're using, but it's very minimal. Please bear in mind though that this opinion is exclusively from watching videos, as for all I know, the combat may have been the most incredible thing ever to experience. I just have my doubts. The soundtrack for this game was composed by Takeharu Ishimoto, who prior to this had worked on the soundtracks for Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy X for Square. After this game, he would go on to compose for many more Square Enix titles, some of which we'll be talking about in upcoming videos. I mentioned the theme of Elfe earlier in the video, and I would like to reiterate that it's a good song. The soundtrack for this game, however, is very limited in scope. 95% of the time, you'll be hearing a bit crushed version of the Turks theme from Final Fantasy VII, and while it fits the tone, and it is an iconic song, it gets a bit grating after hearing it for the 1000th time. The music that plays during combat is called Survive, and it's fine. That's about all I can say really. It's definitely no Those Who Fight Further, that's for sure. I think I may have been spoiled by just how fantastic the soundtrack in Remake was. Anyway, I'm just going to play a few brief samples and pray that copyright doesn't ruin my life. Normally, this is where I'd wrap things up. However, when I first started this project, I said that it was impossible to play this game in the West. While that is indeed true of the original, in 2016, Richter Wilker created a fan remake of the game in RPG Maker 2003. From what I can tell, version 1.0 was released in 2017. However, the game released what appears to be the final finished version earlier this year, which apparently polished off some bugs and added the last of the episodes. Sounds very promising. It would be poor form of me to make a comprehensive history of without investigating this project as well. Let's take a look. First impressions were not great, at least not visually. From what I can tell, Richter cut the characters out of Grimoire's playthrough videos, and as a result, everything looks really blurry and smeary. The portrait art from the original has been badly traced over in MS Paint, and it doesn't look good at all. The movement animations are also quite the sight to behold. But graphics aren't everything, as any player worth their salt knows only too well. The story itself is the main attraction here, and barring some grammatical issues in the text, is completely intact. Combat has been completely reworked, turning it into a traditional ATB turn-based RPG, much like Final Fantasy VII. It's serviceable. However, there is literally no incentive to choose your own commands when you can just select the auto option and have the gameplay itself. The materia system has also been reworked, since there's no camera to take photos, so magic is just found on the ground now. Apparently fire is a red materia instead of the green it's been in every other installment, but that's admittedly me being very nitpicky. Unlike the original, you can only play a shotgun in this version, barring the special episodes. I'm assuming the reason for this is because Shotgun was who Grimoire went through the story with in his playthrough videos of the original. The soundtrack is improved, with much more song variety. I heard tracks from VII and Crisis Core, which is a sensible choice and stops the monotony. Musically, definitely a massive improvement over the original game. The game does have a few glitch-based issues, but they're common to a lot of RPG Maker games that I've played in the past. If you're a fast reader, for example, pressing the buttons to proceed onto the next text window when the game isn't ready yet can lock the whole thing up, and this happened to me multiple times. Combine that with a brutal difficulty and lightning-fast AI reactions during combat, and you really absolutely must save at every opportunity. I have mad respect to Richter for attempting to give us something we missed out on all those years ago, and to release it for free is just wonderful. Unfortunately, I just don't think it's the best that it could be at the moment, and I'm sad to hear he's ceased development, as there's so much potential here. I'll leave a link to the game in the description. Give it a try and see what you think. Before Crisis is an interesting outlier in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. I think it would have been much more fondly remembered if it was on a video game console, perhaps the Nintendo DS, which released around the same time. However, it did make a lot of money in its home market of Japan due to the episodic structure, and sold a lot of phones as well. I'm sure Advent Children also contributed a ton of sales too, but we'll never know for sure. It's truly great to see more from the characters we love as well. When this game first came out, it had been 7 years since we'd last heard from Cloud, Tifa and the others. The Turks are just really cool as well, and I think they were the perfect choice to center this game around. They really matched the stylish aesthetic the developers were aiming for. That just about wraps things up. It's not really my intent to have this be a gaming reviewer channel, so I'm not going to give it a score out of 10 or anything like that. This series is purely to spread awareness and information, and I think I've accomplished that. If by some miracle you have access to the game, I definitely recommend that you give it a go. I would personally love to try it at least once in my lifetime. A 3DS remake of the game was very briefly entertained at one point, but that was years and years ago, and we've never heard anything more on the subject since. Maybe now that we've had Remake Part 1 sell so well and potentially start a new entire timeline, we can have a second compilation of Final Fantasy VII? We can only wonder. Thank you so much for tuning into the very first episode of RetroSpectives. It really means the world to me that you sat through the whole video. I'm very keen to receive any feedback you can offer, so please let me know your thoughts, both good and bad, in the comments below. I'd also like to apologise for not covering every single chapter in detail. I realise I said this was a comprehensive history, so I hope you don't feel I was too disingenuous. If there's a demand for it, I'm more than happy to do an addendum video for this game after I've completed the other entries in the compilation. On that note, thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you again next time for Part 2, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. Goodbye for now.